In this video, I want to talk about a book that I read a while ago called Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman. He's a Nobel Prize winning psychologist. And he wrote this book to talk about the different aspects of our conscious and unconscious minds. And I'll give a very brief summary because you can get an in-depth summary anywhere else on the internet. But basically, what he says is there are two systems in our minds. There's what he calls System 1 and System 2. And System 1 is our unconscious mind, and System 2 is our conscious mind. And the deal with System 1 is it is constantly processing information we receive through our senses. But it's pretty unique in the sense that it has a very specific way that it processes information. It tries to identify cause and effect relationships in everything that it takes in. And it tries to identify these relationships like from the very first piece of information that it receives. So it's always like chattering to our conscious minds, trying to tell us a story about how the world works and how we operate in the world. And it creates this story based on cause and effect relationships. As opposed to what he comments in this book about, like, for instance, statistical relationships. Now, the deal with the System 1, System 2, our unconscious mind and our conscious mind, is that, as I said before, the unconscious mind keeps chattering all the time to our conscious mind, trying to give us explanations for how the world works and what we should think about things that we come across in our daily lives. And typically, our conscious mind takes these inputs uncritically. All right, so we just by default believe what our unconscious minds tell us. Now the problem is, as I said, the unconscious mind just, regardless of the situation, tries to assign cause and effect relationships, and it does so in a pretty rudimentary way, using the very first information that it gets without really trying to identify a nuance in the situation. It just tries to smooth out all the information that it receives and say, okay, here's basically what's going on. This is basically the cause and effect relationship that I can identify. And usually it's biased. A lot of times it's not accurate. Most of the time it's fairly accurate, but there's like no nuance involved. And what is generally the case with the world is that more often than not, things are a lot more nuanced than we ordinarily understand them to be. So that really is the basic theme of the book, is the interplay between our unconscious mind and our conscious mind, and the fact that our unconscious mind just always keeps talking about these cause and effect relationships that it really isn't nuanced in creating. And then our conscious mind, of course, is how we can think rationally and critically about everything that we see in the world, as well as the information that we receive from our unconscious mind. Now, that was supposed to be a quick summary, and I know it wasn't particularly quick. In the first part of this book, only in the first couple chapters, because there's a lot in this book, I'll be doing multiple videos on it, there are a couple things that I think would be relevant to you that I want to bring up in this video. The first one that he talks about is, and this is going to sound very obvious and intuitive, is that when we have to struggle to understand something, we use more of our brains to do so. If something comes very easy, we almost sometimes don't even have to really think about it consciously. We can just automatically do it. But if you think about studying, a hard subject in school, or you come across, some difficult concept in your job or in something that you read, and you really have to focus on it, what's interesting is that you use more of your mind than you otherwise would if something came easily. Now, I draw an analogy to like weightlifting in the gym. All right, if you go to the gym and you're never stressing yourself, you're probably not going to get a whole lot fitter and stronger. Okay, the way the human body works is that it's going to adapt in the manner that it needs to. So you're not going to develop muscles unless you do things that require stronger muscles. You're not going to develop better aerobic conditioning unless you do things that require better aerobic conditioning. The same thing is true for your mind. If you don't stress it, if you don't challenge yourself, challenge your conscious mind to slow down and focus on things deliberately and struggle to work out problems or understand difficult concepts, or even simply to wrap your head around and understand a perspective that you haven't considered before. Even though it might not be particularly challenging to understand, it might be unique in the sense that, or it might be challenging in the sense that you simply haven't considered that perspective. But all of these ways, or all of these things that you do, if they stress your conscious mind in terms of making it work harder, your mind will develop these areas of your brain that it uses more so than if you don't challenge your mind. And it will develop more areas of your brain than if you did things that didn't challenge you. So, I think the weightlifting analogy is really good. And it's like, well, okay, yeah, great advice, dude, right? Like, just study hard stuff, but that's not fun, right? Well, here's the deal. And, this ties into the theme of this channel, which is discovering your passion, okay? If you try to, or if you focus on studying something or learning new things related to something that really interests you, then even though it might be a challenge to learn new things, it's still really satisfying and fulfilling. Now, I'm not talking about you necessarily have to discover your passion before you do this kind of thing, but it's like if you make the habit of trying to learn something new that's challenging in some field or some area that you find interesting, in its own right, that you naturally find interesting, then you're going to be motivated. You're going to be motivated to, learn these things, to challenge your mind, to challenge your ability to focus and work through problems and new concepts in a way that you absolutely would not be motivated if you're like studying something or trying to learn something that you were just completely not interested in. In the same way, you would be motivated to go to the gym if they had, a piece of equipment that you really enjoyed using. So even though it might, you might be working hard on the piece of equipment, if you're enjoying yourself, then, you would be motivated to do it and motivated to work harder. And then the harder you work, the more results that you would, eventually see. So that's one point, this idea of, it's important to challenge your mind. And of course, nobody's really going to do that voluntarily unless they enjoy doing it. So try to find something that you enjoy naturally and then stress yourself a little bit, like work a little bit harder to try to understand it at a little deeper level than what you like right now or would otherwise understand it at. All right, so that's concept one. Concept two, this ties into the idea of flow. Now, the concept of flow was made famous by this author, Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi, probably not pronouncing it completely correctly, but the book is called Flow. Really famous book, really famous concept. Humans have experienced it forever, but he was one of the authors, like I say, in relatively recent decades, who really brought it to sort of general consciousness, this idea of flow, which is you experience it's like a heightened level of focus and engagement in an activity that is just the right amount of challenge so that you're fully engaged. It's not too hard, which would discourage you, and it's not too easy, which would cause you to disengage mentally, and your brain might start wandering into something else. But it's just the right amount of challenge and just the right amount of engagement that you're completely immersed in it, and you're not focused on how you're performing. You're simply focused on what you're doing. Like, a common example is, people playing video games, right? That, in a sense, is like a state of flow. You are super engaged. Like somebody could be like, dude, it's time for dinner. It's time for dinner. You wouldn't even hear them, right? Because you're so focused. If it's like something that's skill related, where you really have to focus, there's some sort of task that you have to do that is not too hard, that you're dying every 2 seconds, but it's just enough that like you really have to stay engaged. That's a type of flow experience. Now, the interesting thing that Daniel Kahneman, the author of Thinking Fast and Slow, discusses when he talks about this idea of flow is that there are two things involved in our everyday lives when we have to focus. One is, self-control. Like, you have to force yourself to sit down and focus and study, for instance, if you have like a biology test or you have something that you have to prepare for work or whatever. Like, you have to sit down, you have to focus. That requires self-control. Another aspect of focus is deliberate thought. It's like, well, once you maintain control and you can like force yourself to focus, then you have to think critically about what it is that you're doing. And Daniel Kahneman says these two things, self-control and deliberate focus, are draining. They're like, if we have like, you could think of like a tank of consciousness, and you have a full tank of consciousness. Well, self-control, exercising self-control drains this tank of like consciousness, or maybe like a better concept is willpower. It drains the tank of willpower, as does deliberate thought. Like, deliberate thought is hard, it's like Rodin's The Thinker, that famous like sculpture. It's like there's a reason the dude is hunched over. He doesn't look particularly comfortable, right? Because like, deep thinking is hard. It's not easy. It requires focus. It requires self-control. And how this relates to flow is that, Kahneman is saying when you're in a state of flow, you don't have to focus on maintaining self-control. Like, for instance, and I'm not promoting playing video games, but like if you're playing a video game, you don't have to force yourself to focus, right? Like, it's that engaging. It's like the right amount of testing your skill and entertainment and everything else. You don't have to, you're not draining the tank of willpower for self-control. So all of the tank of willpower and consciousness is focused on the, like, what he says, deliberate thought. I don't know how much deliberate thought there is in playing a video game, but it's the execution of whatever it is that you're doing. So you don't have to maintain self-control. You don't have to maintain focus. That's already there, right? So 100% of your effort can be on doing the task at hand. And, I think that's a really important concept, like a really powerful idea when you tie it into doing something that you love. It doesn't necessarily have to be your passion, but just something that you find really engaging. Because if you create the habit of focusing every day on engaging your mind, challenging your mind with something that you enjoy doing, okay, you won't have to drain this tank of consciousness and willpower so much with the self-control, and you can use more of the effort on the deliberate thought. So, it becomes a really efficient way to build your skill if you're focused on something that you find really engaging. Now, of course, this isn't like, this is pretty obvious, right? I mean, we all have this experience. Of course, we're going to be more engaged in things that we enjoy. But my point is, if you make a habit of doing this every day, even for like 15 minutes, make a habit of every day for 15 minutes, try to learn something new in a field that you find engaging, right? Not only will it develop your mind, like in the same way that weightlifting develops your body, but you will get closer, you will approach this flow state where more of your energy is focused on the deliberate thought aspect and less of your energy is focused on maintaining self-control. Okay, and then there's a third concept. This is the last concept, for this video that Daniel Kahneman talks about in this book. And it's the idea that, when you learn new things, your brain makes new connections, between ideas that you've already learned, ideas you've already had, perspectives that you have. Now, of course, this is not new. Everybody knows this, right? Your brain makes connections. All the neurons are connecting all over the place. But what he talks about is that only a fraction of the new connections that are made consciously. Most of the connections that are made in your unconscious. Now, you might say, well, sure, dude. I mean, I'm not conscious of my neurons making connections, but that's not the point. I'm not talking about like physiologically what's going on. I'm talking about, let's suppose you read something new and you're like, oh, this reminds me of this other thing. And you consciously draw a connection between two things. Well, that's great. but that's just the tip of the iceberg. So much more is going on beneath the surface in terms of connections that are being made. It's like, the payoff is so much greater than you realize. Now, like an analogy I might use, let's say you go to the gym and you do bicep curls. Well, you know that it's going to make your biceps stronger. You do, if you challenge yourself. But if I draw an analogy to this, it would be like, well, doing bicep curls helps grow your biceps, but it also increases like muscular development all over your body. I'm not saying it does with weightlifting, but I'm saying this is the analogy. And so it would be like, wow, there's a much bigger payoff than just developing my biceps doing curls. It's all this other stuff that's going on. Well, apparently that's really what's going on in your mind, where you learn these new things, you make new connections. You're only aware of a small fraction of the connections that are being made. So the development that's going on in your mind is much, much greater than you're even aware of. So to tie these three concepts together, which I think are really important, and I think you should make a habit of focusing on this every day, just 15 minutes. One, it's the idea of, challenging yourself. Find something that you're already engaged in, and for 15 minutes a day, try to learn new things about it so that you'll already be motivated, you'll already be engaged, and you'll be exercising your mind in the same way you exercise your body when you go to the gym. Two, and this is not something you have to consciously focus on, but recognize that when you are studying these new ideas, challenging ideas, in an area that you really enjoy, less of your mental effort, your willpower, it has to go towards self-control, the focus. So more of it can be focused on learning what it is you're trying to learn. So it's a lot more efficient when this happens. And then the third thing is, when you're stressing your mind, when you're working your capacity to understand new concepts and new perspectives, you're only conscious of a small fraction of the development that's going on in your mind. All the connections that are being made, and the new way of seeing things and the new way of relating to these things. And this might be a case, I think it probably is, where you might study things and learn new things for a long time, like years. And you might be conscious of, okay, well, I learned this and I learned this, but there's so much that's going on beneath the surface that eventually you'll start realizing benefits, even though you might not be conscious that it was because of learning all these new concepts and ideas. Hopefully you'll get to the point one day you're like, wow, you just feel smarter. Like, you can see how things relate that you couldn't see before, and you can see new perspectives easier than you could see before, and you have more ideas than you had before. And all of these things might happen. You might not realize that probably a lot has to do with the fact that you challenged yourself, you really focused, you made new connections, but so much was happening below the surface that you weren't even aware of it. So, it's one of these, I highly recommend develop the habit, because I think this is a case where it will take a long time, months or years, probably closer to years than months, before you really are aware of the benefits, even though you might not be aware, years down the road as to why you obtain the benefits. So the importance of developing a habit, doing something every day, is so that it becomes part of your schedule and you don't have to motivate yourself during the period where you don't see any progress. It's just like if you go to the gym, you need to initially you need to develop the habit of going to the gym, and because if you're like overweight and out of shape, it's going to be a while before you really start noticing improvements. You're not going to notice like, oh my God, I just lost 5 pounds after going to the gym for 3 days. It doesn't work that way, right? It takes time. It takes weeks or months before you really start feeling it. So, you need to develop the habit, and so that you have, so it takes less willpower to go to the gym every day, and more of just, I go to the gym because it's part of my schedule. The same thing for this. If you make the habit of learning new things in an area that you love, eventually, and it might be years, but eventually, as the habit develops into just part of who you are and you spend more and more time doing it, you'll be able to start seeing the benefits. And unlike weightlifting, where if you're getting stronger is because you go to the gym, you might not know exactly why you're able to form all these new connections, but it will probably be in no small part because of the way you challenged your mind, particularly doing things that engaged you so that you were really focused. Okay, I think I made my point clear. I don't want to talk about this over and over again. So those 3 ideas: find something you love, make a habit of it, do it every day. Thank you so much for watching. I hope this was useful, and I will see you in the next video.